It started with small things I thought were normal because that was all I ever knew. My mom would help me pick out my clothes until I was 16, brushing off my protests with a tight-lipped smile and a passive-aggressive, "You just don't have an eye for what suits you," while my dad, silent and looming, always backed her up with his presence even if he never spoke much. And I remember the sinking feeling in my stomach when I tried to bring up wanting to get a part-time job in high school. Just something simple like working the register at the bookstore near our house. But every time I mentioned it, my mom would fake a fainting spell or cry about how I clearly hated her because why else would I want to leave her for strangers? And then Dad would come into my room late at night, not yelling, but talking so quietly that it was scarier than yelling. Telling me about the bad people out there who prey on naive girls, asking if I wanted to end up raped or killed in Somali just because I thought I was grown, and even though a part of me knew it was too much, I didn't want to be ungrateful. I didn't want to be the bad daughter. So I let it go, but it didn't end there. Not even close, because when I got my first acceptance letter to a university 3 hours away, I was so excited, I ran through the house holding the envelope like a golden ticket, ready to share the good news, thinking maybe this time they'd be proud, but the look on my mom's face made my blood run cold. She turned white, then red, then stormed out of the room without a word, and later that night, after hours of silence, she calmly told me they had called the university and declined my acceptance on my behalf, claiming family medical issues, and when I screamed at her, begged her to undo it, told her I was 18, and she had no right, she just smiled and said, "You'll thank us one day," while Dad nodded solemnly like a priest delivering a cruel sermon. And after that, they took away my phone, my laptop, even my door. Said I was too emotional and needed time to settle down, and I remember sitting on the floor of my room, no lock, no privacy, trying to figure out if maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe they were right, maybe the world was too dangerous for someone like me, and for a while I stopped fighting. I enrolled in a local community college like they wanted, stayed at home like they demanded, and I convinced myself it was temporary, that I'd save up, plan quietly, leave when the time was right. But I hadn't accounted for how far they'd go to keep me tethered, because when I got close to a guy in one of my classes, a sweet, quiet person who made me feel seen, my mom started showing up at school randomly, watching from her car, telling professors she was worried about my mental health, and when I finally introduced him to her, thinking maybe transparency would ease the tension, she grilled him like a detective, asked about his income, his family, his medical history, and then told me later she'd done a background check and found concerning behavior, though she never showed me anything and refused to say what she meant. Just shook her head like I was a child who couldn't see the fire she was saving me from. And then, one day, he stopped talking to me, completely ghosted me. And a week later, I got an anonymous message through an old email account saying my mom had contacted his employer and accused him of trying to exploit me. And even though I had no proof, I knew it was her. I knew it. And that was the first time I truly understood I was not just being sheltered, I was being controlled. And any attempt to step outside their boundaries would be met with retaliation. But even then, I didn't leave, because how do you leave when you have no savings, no car, no access to your own bank account, no friends they haven't driven away? And the very idea of escape makes you feel both guilty and terrified, like maybe you're the villain, maybe you're betraying the people who love you. And so I stayed, and I died a little more inside every day until I got sick, actually sick. Not emotionally, not made up, but they wouldn't let me see a doctor without them in the room, wouldn't let me get therapy unless it was one they approved. And every session turned into a strange ritual where the therapist would ask leading questions about how much I appreciated my parents' sacrifices and if I understood how hard it was to be a mother. And I felt like I was drowning in honey, suffocating in something sweet and sticky and inescapable. And the final straw came the day I found my journal, my private journal, in the trash, torn up and soaked in water. And when I confronted them, they didn't deny it, just said, "Some thoughts are better left unwritten," and I felt something in me crack, like a bone under too much pressure, and I knew, deep down, I had two choices: either find a way out, or die slowly in a cage that looked like a home. And so I began to plan in secret again, but this time with desperation instead of hope, this time knowing that if I failed, they'd take away everything, and the price of independence might be losing them forever. But I was finally starting to believe that was a price worth paying. I started hiding bits of money in places so random even I forgot where some of it was inside tampon boxes, under the lining of my winter boots, folded into the back of photo frames, and every dollar felt like a rebellion, like I was stealing pieces of my life back one coin at a time. But saving wasn't easy because I had no job, only the occasional cash they gave me for errands or birthdays, and even that came with strings attached, always followed by lectures about how lucky I was. How most people my age were drowning in student loans or living with roommates who stole from them, and wasn't it better to be safe here, with people who loved me? And every time they said loved, I felt a new wave of nausea because if this was love, then maybe I didn't want it. Maybe love wasn't supposed to feel like surveillance, like every step I took was being measured and judged and stored away to be used against me later. And the hardest part was pretending I was getting better, pretending I was grateful, pretending I wasn't planning my escape like a prisoner digging through concrete with a spoon. And I started visiting the public library more often, telling them I needed books for school, and they allowed it because it seemed harmless. But the truth was, that library became my lifeline, a place where no one followed me, where I could use the free computers to apply for jobs in secret, research shelters and roommates and cities far enough away that they'd never bothered to come find me. And one day, after weeks of trying, I got an email from a small bakery across town saying they were willing to give me a trial shift, and I remember crying in the middle of the stacks, burying my face in a hardcover book so the librarian wouldn't ask questions, because it was the first time in years that someone had said yes to me, not to the version my parents approved of. And the day of the shift, I lied and said I had a study group, and I felt my heart pounding the entire time I was there, waiting for my mom to burst through the door and drag me out by my hair, but she didn't, and I made $30 under the table, and it felt like a million, like freedom had a flavor, and it tasted like powdered sugar and coffee grounds and possibility. And that night, I didn't sleep. Just stared at the ceiling and imagined what it would be like to have my own space, my own silence, to choose what to wear, who to love, what to believe. And I didn't tell a soul, not even the one friend I still had from high school who messaged me sometimes late at night, asking if I was okay, because trust felt too expensive, too risky, and I couldn't afford to make mistakes. Not when I knew what they were capable of. And then one day, the bakery offered me a weekend shift, permanent if I wanted it, and I knew that wasn't my opening, my first real foothold on the wall they built around me, and I told my parents. The college needed volunteers on Saturdays for some mandatory credit, and my mom tried to say no, that weekends were for family, but I stood my ground, and for a moment her eyes flared with something primal and sharp, but she let me go. And I knew she didn't believe me, not really, so I made sure to cover my tracks, wore the same hoodie to work that I did at home, deleted every text, wiped browser history, and kept my tips in a small metal box buried under art supplies they hadn't touched in years. And for a while, it worked. For a few precious months, I felt like I was moving forward, like I had a secret map and I was slowly unfolding it, one job shift, one bus ride, one lie at a time, but control like theirs doesn't loosen quietly. It claws back with venom, and I should have seen it coming. The way my mom started asking more questions, started calling during my supposed volunteer time, started crying again at the dinner table, and saying things like, "You don't smile at me like you used to," and I should have known that was a warning shot. But I was so focused on my exit plan that I got careless, and one night after work, I came home later than I said I would, just 20 minutes in. I walked into the kitchen and saw my parents sitting there, both silent, both staring at my bag, and I knew immediately something was wrong. And my dad gestured for me to sit, and he placed my phone on the table, screen up, unlocked, and my stomach dropped because I had never given them my password, and my mom smiled so gently it made my skin crawl and said, "You shouldn't keep secrets from the people who love you." And then they began question after question, accusation after accusation, demanding to know who I was seeing, what I was hiding, where I'd been going, and when I said volunteering, my dad slapped the table so hard the plates jumped, and he said, "Enough lies." And for the first time in my life, I yelled back. I stood up and told them I was done being controlled, that I was leaving, that they could not stop me. And I watched my mom's face contort into something monstrous, something I didn't recognize, and she started crying ugly, hysterical sobs, and grabbed my hands and said, "Don't let them take you from us," like I was being kidnapped, instead of trying to live. And my dad got up, walked away, came back with a set of car keys and said, "You want out? Then leave, right now." And I froze because I didn't expect that. And the room went silent, and for one terrifying second, I almost said yes, almost took the keys, almost ran, but then I saw the smirk forming on his face, the trap in his eyes, and I realized too late that he knew I wasn't ready yet, that I didn't have enough saved, that I still needed more time, and if I said yes, he'd use it against me, tell everyone I'd abandoned them, punish me in ways I couldn't even imagine. So I sat back down and said nothing, and for days after that, the house was quiet like a bomb before detonation, and I knew I had to accelerate my plan, had to leave soon, not someday, not eventually, but soon, because next time, they wouldn't wait for me to run, they'd lock every door, cut off every route, and I'd be buried alive in the house I grew up in. So I worked double shifts, I slept in my clothes, I kept a bag packed under my bed, and I counted every second until I could disappear. The day I left, it wasn't cinematic. It wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming or a suitcase flung down the stairs. It was quiet, surgical, like slipping out of a body that never fit right. And I remember waking up at 4:17 a.m., heart pounding. So loudly I was sure it would wake the whole house, but I moved like a ghost, grabbed the bag I'd packed and repacked for weeks, heavy with clothes, charger, the crumpled envelope of cash, a flash drive of my documents, and the small photo of me at age 5 that I kept because I didn't want to forget the version of myself who still smiled without fear. And I didn't write a note because what was there to say that wouldn't be twisted or weaponized or ignored? And I slipped out through the back door like a thief in the home I'd never truly been allowed to claim, walked down the block to where my friend was waiting in her old Honda, engine running, eyes wide with adrenaline and fear, and when I opened the door and sat down, she grabbed my hand and said, "You're sure?" And I nodded so hard I thought my neck would snap because I had never been more sure of anything, and as we drove away, I didn't look back, not at the porch light that flickered when it rained, not at the curtains I used to stare out of when I dreamed of freedom, not at the house where love had been confused with possession for so long that I had begun to think they were the same, and we drove to a city 2 hours away, where her cousin had a spare room and a heart big enough to lend it to me without questions. And for the first time in my life, I had a key that no one could take, a bed that was mine, a phone I bought with my own money, and the silence was deafening in the best possible way. No footsteps outside my door, no forced hugs, no emotionally loaded sighs, just me and the echoes of my own breath. And the first few nights I couldn't sleep, not because I missed them, but because I didn't yet trust that it was real. I kept waiting for the knock on the door, the sudden appearance of my father's voice saying, "That's enough, come home." But it never came, and when my mom did call 26 times in one day, I didn't answer, not because I hated her, but because I knew if I heard her voice, I might crumble, might fall back into the web of guilt and obligation and manipulation that had wrapped around me since childhood, and I needed time. I needed distance. I needed to learn how to exist without someone else pulling the strings, and the hardest part wasn't being alone. It was in learning the voice in my head that still asked for permission to breathe, to rest, to want, and I started therapy at a low-cost clinic downtown, where the woman across from me didn't flinch when I told her how I hadn't been allowed to shut my bedroom door, or how my mom read my journals and told me my thoughts were sinful, or how my dad once hid my shoes so I couldn't leave the house after I refused to cancel a study date, and she looked me in the eye and said, "That's abuse." And I flinched because I had never used that word before, never allowed myself to call it what it was, because I thought abuse was bruises and yelling and chaos, not pretty houses with floral wallpaper and dinner on the table and parents who said they'd die without you. But she helped me see the bars of the cage I'd grown up in, painted gold and wrapped in guilt, and slowly I began to build a new version of myself, one that didn't need approval to exist, one that could walk into a room without shrinking, one that didn't apologize every time I said no. And I found work at a small cafe, the kind of place where the regulars know your name and tip in coins and kindness. And I took night classes again, not because anyone forced me, but because I wanted to. And for the first time, learning felt like liberation instead of obligation. And there were setbacks, of course there were, nights when I cried myself to sleep because I missed the idea of parents, of home, of safety, even if those things had never really been true. and there were moments when I reached for the phone, typed out long messages that I deleted before sending, wondering if they miss me, if they changed, if they ever saw me as a person instead of a possession. And one day, I got a letter in the mail with no return address, just my name in my mother's handwriting, and I opened it with shaking hands to find 3 pages of carefully crafted guilt, how I had embarrassed them, how I had ruined their reputation, how they had done everything out of love and couldn't understand why I was so cruel. And the last line read, "We're still your parents, no matter what," and I stared at those words for a long time because they were both true and not, because biology does not equal love, because control is not care, and I folded the letter and put it away in a drawer not to keep as a memory, but as a reminder of what I had escaped. And when my therapist asked what I wanted from the future, I said, peace, and she nodded like that made sense. Like, peace wasn't a small thing, and now, months later, I still wake up some mornings expecting to be dragged back, still feel guilt ripple through me when I buy something for myself or say no to someone's request. But I'm learning that guilt is not the same as wrong, that my autonomy is not a betrayal, and that leaving people who hurt you even if they're your parents is not heartlessness, it's healing, and I haven't forgiven them yet. Maybe. I never will, but I've stopped waiting for their permission to be whole, and some nights I light a candle in my tiny room and whisper to the girl I used to be, the one who stared out the window and wished, and I tell her, we made it, not unscarred, not untouched, but free. Freedom, I've learned, isn't a finish line, it's a daily decision, a quiet rebellion repeated in the smallest choices, like whether to answer the phone when a familiar number flashes on the screen or whether to trust someone new enough to let them know my real name. And some days, even now, I hesitate because the past clings like a shadow, and I've had to retrain myself to recognize safety, to understand that someone asking how was your day isn't always a prelude to control, that love doesn't have to come wrapped in fear, and slowly, I've built something resembling a life, a messy, imperfect, honest life that belongs to me, stitched together from library books, bus rides, late night tears, and the quiet victories of waking up without dread. And I still rent that tiny room in my friend's cousin's house, the one with appealing paint and a window that sticks, but it's mine, and the walls don't whisper my failures back to me, don't hold decades of expectation and disappointment. And every corner is filled with things I chose, a stack of used paperbacks, postcards from places I want to visit, a mirror I can actually look into without seeing someone else's reflection staring back, and I've made friends, not many, but the kind who don't flinch when I tell them bits of my story, who don't say, but they're your parents, with that moral superiority that people love to wield when they've never been owned by someone who claimed it was out of love. And one friend, a girl named Lena I met at work, once held my hand after a shift and said, "You're the bravest person I know." And I cried so hard in the storage room I couldn't breathe because I had spent so long feeling like a coward, like someone who had waited too long, fled too late, broken too much, and to be seen not just as a survivor, but as someone strong and unraveled something inside me in the best way. And I've stopped hiding parts of myself, stopped apologizing for the scars I carry or the boundaries I draw. And every time I tell my story, even just a piece of it, I feel the chains loosen a little more, like maybe the truth can set me free in ways I never thought possible. And I've started journaling again, not to vent or cry, but to remember, to honor the road I walked and the girl who walked it. And sometimes I write letters I'll never send. One to my mom where I asked why she couldn't see me as separate from her, why she only felt loved when I was small and scared and dependent, and one to my dad where I say that silence can be more violent than words, that standing beside someone while they hurt you doesn't absolve you of complicity. And I write these things not to reopen wounds, but to cleanse them, because healing isn't about forgetting, it's about facing the truth and still choosing to move forward. And one day, I got an invitation in the mail to a family event, my cousin's wedding, addressed to Miss, not even my full name, like I'd been demoted to an idea, a ghost they didn't know how to categorize anymore, and I held it in my hand for hours, wondering if showing up would mean reclaiming something or just opening a door that had finally stayed shut. And in the end, I didn't go, not out of spite, but out of clarity, because I didn't need to prove anything anymore. And walking away was no longer an act of defiance, it was just peace. And as I sat in my room that evening, eating noodles and watching the sun sink through my window, I felt it settle in me like a truth I had finally stopped running from. I didn't owe my life to the people who tried to control it. I didn't owe my voice to the people who tried to silence it, and I didn't owe my healing to anyone but myself. And now, when I pass mirrors or storefront windows, I sometimes stop and look not to check if I'm presentable or pleasing, but just to see me, the woman who got out, the woman who stayed gone, the woman who chose to live even when it meant burning the blueprint of everything she was taught to be. And I don't know what's next. I really don't. Maybe school, maybe travel, maybe falling in love with someone who doesn't think love means ownership, but whatever it is, I know one thing with absolute certainty: I will walk into it on my own terms, with my head held high and my heart intact. Because the girl who once begged for permission to dream is now the woman who gives herself permission to soar, and that is enough, more than enough, because in the end, the most extreme measure I took was choosing myself, again and again, even when it hurt, even when it terrified me, even when I wasn't sure I deserved it, and that is the kind of freedom no one can take away.